This is my great-grandfather's clock. Presented to him when he retired from the Royal College of Music in December of 1956. A year prior to that, his future daughter-in-law, my grandmother, would come to Britain, having previously, among other things, worked in one of the bars that Robert Blair Mayne, often known as Paddy Mayne, a co-founder of the British SAS, used to drink in after World War II. Maybe that's a story for another time, but why I'm showing you this clock is partly because, well, 40 years prior to receiving this clock, Great Granddad Henry was in a very different place. And so, here we are, in Empire Earth recreating it. He drove the wagons that brought the shells to the guns. Many were targeted by artillery, or just happened to be where an explosion was. Could be that random. Great Granddad Henry would have lost a lot of friends, and as he was also single, he was a lower priority for going home after the war, and part of what he did was grave registration. I don't know whether he registered his brother's grave, but when you're delivering shells as powerful as those, and a bomb lands near the wagon or hits the wagon, or an artillery shell hits, it's going to go up. And given how destructive they were, there is no way you'd survive if you were one of the unlucky ones who got hit. And so he'd be driving from the rear echelon to the front lines with the ammunition, knowing each commute could be his last for a number of years. And also seeing the life in the war of the people there, all the communities trying to live their lives and carry on as the war raged nearby. We even know that he, being a painter, he painted a barman that he met whilst he was serving out in France during that First World War. Of course, he would eventually go home. He'd eventually get back. He'd survived. And would marry a munitions worker. My great-grandmother, Louise, who, as I say, made munitions during the war, as an experimental shell filler. A quite dangerous job, testing out new ammunition types and new explosives. And, could probably understand how he felt in a lot of ways, given that she'd risk her life in her job too on a daily basis. Whether she made any of the munitions he delivered, there's no way of knowing, though it is possible. But then again, it probably brings up a question to a lot of people. What does it all mean? How do we find meaning and understanding in all this? Well, that is probably a question, as we discussed in the D-Day video, that a lot of historians grapple with the question of finding meaning in all these events. Some might take a more macro, higher up level approach, such as seeing a world adapting to the new developments in technology, trade and civil society as they grow and develop. And people get kind of swept up in these new kind of ways as the new machinery of life and war grows and people adapt to the new world that science and industry has brought upon them. I mean, that's not the only way people have found to try and create meaning from it all. Oh, there are others who look less to those kind of ideas, and more to the immaterial, as it were, higher cultural values. What people believed, what people valued, what people wanted, the world that they were hoping to preserve or hoping would come after the war, what they were fighting for. They always, they used to talk about at the time the Great War for Civilization, and what values they felt were at stake. Of course, others take the more micro, as it were, approach, and see the war through the lens of the different groups of people involved. After all, it was a world war, and the great powers brought their empires with them, and not just there, but as we talked about with great-grandmother Louise. And there are all sorts of people that the war affected in all sorts of different ways, depending on who they were and what their background was. But there is, of course, other ways as well. The sort of material war and the way life changed and how it shaped people by being part of these momentous events. What personal values would they hold, having been through all of this, having gone through all that, as it were, and the way it shapes their understanding of the world. There's often said that Tolkien drew a lot of inspiration for the way he wrote about war in Lord of the Rings from his experiences in the First World War. Now, I don't know whether... I never met Great Granddad Henry. He died before I was born, or on as far as I remember. And so, I rely on what others have told me about him, those who knew him. And from what people tell me about him, he was glad to be alive. Probably having seen so many wagon drivers who weren't, and his own brother having died of Spanish flu while over in France. And he carried on. He came back. He'd marry Louise. And work with the Royal College of Music. And paint. We have some of his paintings in our home. He was glad to be alive. Just so easily could have not been. Yeah. Part of the reason why this topic came up was recently I've been watching a channel called Robert Loves Games, and some of the videos on Foxhole with the logistics. And we think, Great Granddad Henry used to do that. Only there wasn't any respawn in the First World War. As you probably can tell. So, when he came home, that's all I can say. He was glad to be alive, and his clock was given to him as a retirement to the end of a life of loving art, music, and family. He'd have a son called Peter who'd lived through the Blitz during the Second World War. And then Peter's son, my dad, will be a World War I historian. and that wisdom be passed down, and, well, it may not have been the war to end all wars, but all those who served and serve, it was lovely having you here.